The moment she stepped into the jungle, she realized she had entered a world entirely alive, one that breathed and moved around her in ways she had never experienced. The air was thick and humid, clinging to her skin like a damp blanket, carrying the musky scent of wet earth, rotting leaves, and vegetation so dense it almost seemed to pulse with life. Every breath she took felt heavy, charged with the presence of something primal, something older than any place she had ever known. It was a beauty that felt dangerous, seductive yet intimidating, reminding her that she was a visitor in a realm that had existed long before her and would endure long after she left. The jungle's symphony was relentless. Birdsong layered over the rustling of leaves as unseen creatures moved beneath the canopy. Occasionally, a louder splash or crack of a branch echoed through the undergrowth, making her pulse quicken. There was a rhythm to it, a chaotic melody that felt simultaneously inviting and threatening. Her ears strained to separate each sound, to identify which were harmless and which could signal danger. Even as she tried to focus, the cacophony made her senses hyper-aware, sharpening her instincts in a way that no previous experience had. Light played tricks on her as well. The dense canopy above filtered sunlight into a patchwork of gold and shadow, casting moving patterns on the forest floor that seemed alive. Shadows shifted constantly, making every bush, vine, and fallen log appear potentially dangerous. She found herself pausing at every step, noticing the subtle movements of leaves and the faint glimmer of insects crawling along tree trunks. Each detail demanded attention, and she realized instantly that distraction could be deadly here. The tactile experience of the jungle was just as intense. Vines brushed against her arms, sometimes sharp or sticky, and the damp soil clung to her boots with every step. Her hands occasionally brushed against wet leaves that dripped condensation, slick and unpredictable. The sensation of moisture on her skin, combined with the warmth of the air and the exertion of movement, created a physical weight that made her feel both grounded and trapped at the same time. Even breathing required conscious effort. The air was heavy, thick, and humid, filling her lungs in a way that was at once vital and exhausting. As she moved deeper, the jungle seemed to react to her presence. Every small sound she made echoed, alerting unseen creatures, and she felt eyes on her from the shadows. Monkeys called in distant trees, insects buzzed closer, and the occasional rustle of a snake or small animal reminded her that she was never truly alone. The overwhelming senses forced her into a state of acute awareness. She began to understand that survival here was not about fear, it was about recognition, observation, and respect. Every smell, every sound, every sensation carried information. She could not afford to ignore them, because in the jungle, awareness was as essential as oxygen. By the time she paused to rest, her senses were alive and exhausted at once. The beauty of the jungle was undeniable, but so was its intensity. It demanded respect, vigilance, and humility. And even though she felt overwhelmed, a flicker of excitement stirred within her. She had entered a place of challenge, danger, and wonder, and the first day had already begun to teach her that the jungle would be a master she could neither ignore nor control. Hours passed as she cautiously moved through the jungle, every step measured, every glance scanning the dense undergrowth for danger. Her eyes searched tirelessly for a place that could serve as a temporary home, a haven where she could rest without fear of immediate threat. Most clearings were unsuitable, either too small to build a shelter, too close to thick vegetation that could hide predators, or too wet and swampy to provide stable footing. Each rejection weighed on her, the frustration mixing with the anxiety of realizing that choosing poorly could cost her more than just comfort. Then, as the light filtered through the canopy in long, dappled beams, she spotted a relatively open clearing, bordered on three sides by tall, thick trees and protected on the remaining side by a gentle slope. The ground was dry and flat, covered with a thin layer of fallen leaves, and, most importantly, free of immediate signs of snakes or other wildlife. Her pulse quickened with relief. This was a rare gift in the jungle, a small pocket of stability in a world that offered none easily. She approached carefully, examining every inch of the ground for hidden hazards, aware that even one misstep could bring trouble. Once satisfied, she dropped to her knees and began to gather materials, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Branches and sticks of varying lengths were collected to form the foundation of a shelter, while broad leaves and thick vines would serve as protective layers against rain and insects. She tested each vine for strength, flexing it in her hands, discarding those that snapped too easily, and twisted the stronger ones into loops for securing the framework. The process was slow and meticulous, every choice influenced by the knowledge that the jungle would exploit any weakness in her construction. As she worked, the awareness of danger never left her. The The jungle was alive around her, full of movement she could not always see. The rustle of leaves could signal an insect, a small animal, or something far more dangerous. Her hands occasionally brushed against hidden ants or spiders, and the sound of water trickling nearby reminded her that wet areas could hide snakes. She learned instinctively to move slowly, to place materials carefully, and to constantly scan her surroundings, understanding that safety was never guaranteed. By late afternoon, the shelter began to take shape. A basic framework of sticks tied together with vines stood upright, and layers of leaves were woven across the top and sides, forming a crude roof. It was far from perfect. The walls sagged slightly, and gaps remained where rain could seep in, but it was enough to give her a sense of security. For the first time since entering the jungle, she allowed herself a brief smile. This small patch of cleared ground, with her shelter taking shape, represented more than protection. It was a foothold, a starting point from which she could learn to survive. As the sun dipped lower, she arranged a small sleeping area inside, using additional leaves to create insulation from the damp forest floor. She paused to take in her surroundings, feeling the shift from tension to cautious accomplishment. Exhausted but resolute, she realized that choosing this clearing and beginning to build a shelter was the first concrete step in taking control of her situation. The jungle was still dangerous, unpredictable, and alive, but she had carved out a space within it, a place where she could rest, observe, and prepare for the challenges the following days would inevitably bring. With a clearing finally claimed and a rudimentary shelter taking shape, she turned her attention to the task of survival, collecting materials that would keep her safe and sustain her through the night. The jungle offered no guidance, no instructions. Every decision had to be made through observation, trial, and instinct. She knelt among the ferns and vines, her hands sifting through damp leaves and broken branches, learning quickly which materials were strong enough to hold weight and which would snap under pressure. Twisting a vine in her hand, she tested its strength, feeling the fibers stretch and resist before securing it to her framework. Each successful connection was a small victory, proof that she could manipulate this wild world. If only carefully and patiently, she moved with purpose, constantly aware that every rustle, every snap of a twig could signal danger. Snakes slid silently through the underbrush, their presence betrayed only by the faint shimmer of scales or a sudden flicker of movement. Ants crawled across her hands, leaving tiny, painful bites in their wake. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, their bites itching and burning through every layer of clothing. The collection of materials became a test of endurance, a battle between the discomfort of her own body and the necessity of creating something that could keep her alive. Leaves, broad and thick, were gathered to form the walls and roof of her shelter. She learned quickly that not all leaves were created equal. Some were too fragile and tore under their own weight, while others were too wet and heavy to hold in place. Branches were selected for the framework, the thickest and strongest she could find, yet light enough for her to carry across the uneven, slippery ground. Even the soil itself was a resource. She pressed mud and leaf litter together to stabilize the base of her shelter, improvising techniques she had never imagined using. Every choice was a lesson in patience and adaptation, in learning to see the forest not as a chaotic mass, but as a storehouse of resources to be understood and respected. As the day wore on, the sun dipped lower through the canopy, sending shifting patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor. She paused frequently to scan her surroundings, her eyes adjusting to the dimming light, her ears alert for any sudden sounds that might indicate nearby predators. The jungle seemed alive with hidden movement, and she became hyper-aware of every vibration, every subtle rustle in the undergrowth. Survival required more than skill with materials. It required constant observation and an instinctive understanding of her environment. By late afternoon, she had gathered enough sticks, leaves, and vines to begin constructing a more secure portion of her shelter. She tied, layered, and reinforced, feeling a mix of fatigue and satisfaction with each successful addition. Her hands were scratched, her arms sore, and her clothes damp with sweat and jungle moisture, but she could see progress. What had begun as a vague idea, a simple shelter in a clearing, was slowly transforming into a tangible structure that would protect her from rain, insects, and the uncertainties of the night. In that moment, she realized the importance of resourcefulness and patience. In a place that offered no guarantees, survival depended entirely on her ability to observe, collect, and adapt, turning the jungle's raw chaos into a fragile, livable space she could call home. Even as she gathered materials and began shaping her shelter, the jungle reminded her that danger was never far away. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, carried with it the possibility of predators she could neither see nor anticipate. Snakes, laced with venom, slithered silently through the undergrowth, leaving only the faintest hint of movement for those paying close attention. Insects swarmed relentlessly, some merely irritating, others capable of spreading disease or delivering painful bites. She quickly learned that survival in this environment depended as much on awareness and respect for its inhabitants as it did on building a shelter or collecting food. Her first encounters with the jungle's more subtle dangers came in the form of insects. Mosquitoes buzzed incessantly around her head, some finding gaps in her clothing to bite relentlessly. Ants crawled over her arms and hands, leaving stings that burned sharply and made her wince. She discovered that even brushing past a vine or a low, hanging branch could provoke a defensive creature, be it a spider, centipede, or scorpion. Each sting, each painful encounter, was a lesson teaching her to move deliberately, to inspect her path, and to recognize that even small creatures could wield power in this ecosystem. Snakes were another constant concern. One moment, the jungle appeared calm, almost serene, and the next, a subtle movement on the forest floor or the glint of scales beneath a leaf sent her heart racing. She learned to step carefully, testing the ground with her hands or a stick before placing her weight fully. Each interaction, each near encounter, heightened her awareness and reinforced the importance of respect and caution. The jungle was not cruel, it was indifferent. Mistakes could be fatal, but careful observation and patience could mean the difference between life and death. Even larger animals, though less frequently encountered, loomed in her thoughts. The distant roar of a jaguar or the call of howler monkeys reminded her constantly that she was not alone. Their presence shaped her behavior, influencing where she chose to walk, where she set her shelter, and how she moved through the dense vegetation. She understood instinctively that the jungle had its own hierarchy and rules, and that to survive, she had to fit herself into its rhythm rather than impose her own. By the end of the day, she had not only collected the necessary materials, but also gained a deeper understanding of the jungle's dangers and how to navigate them. Survival required vigilance at every step, respect for the creatures she shared the space with, and a constant awareness of her surroundings. The jungle's threats were real and persistent, but each encounter also taught her resilience, patience, and the importance of moving carefully and deliberately. What might have seemed terrifying at first gradually became a framework for understanding, a series of rules she could learn to follow. In this way, danger became both a teacher and a guide, shaping her actions and forcing her to grow in awareness and skill. By nightfall, as she rested inside her newly built shelter, she realized that understanding the jungle's dangers was not just about staying alive. It was about learning to coexist with a world far wilder and more powerful than she had ever imagined. As night began to settle over the jungle, a sense of exhaustion and accomplishment washed over her. The shelter she had labored to build now stood as a fragile testament to her first day of survival, a small oasis of stability in the midst of a vast, unpredictable wilderness. Crawling inside, she felt the weight of the day pressing down, sore muscles, scratches from vines and branches, and a body coated with sweat and the grime of the forest floor. Yet despite the fatigue, a spark of hope glimmered within her, a quiet reassurance that she had taken the first step toward enduring this untamed world. Sitting inside her makeshift home, she listened closely to the jungle's nocturnal symphony. The sounds that had seemed overwhelming and threatening earlier, the calls of unseen creatures, the rustling of leaves, the distant crash of a waterfall, now became a backdrop to her thoughts. Each sound reminded her that she was alive, that she had claimed a space in this living, breathing ecosystem, and that her efforts had kept her safe, at least for tonight. The jungle was still alive around her, still full of hidden dangers, but she had created a temporary sanctuary from which she could observe and learn. Resting did not come easily. The shelter was basic and offered little protection from the humidity, the creeping insects, or the occasional skitter of small creatures that found their way inside. Every rustle of leaves, every flutter of wings made her heart jump, reminding her that survival was a continuous effort. Yet even in these moments of unease, she felt a sense of pride. She had learned, adapted, and acted decisively to create a place where she could lie down without fear of immediate threat. That small accomplishment, though modest in the grand scale of the jungle, was monumental in the context of her first day. She thought back on the steps she had taken choosing the clearing, carefully collecting materials, testing vines and branches for strength, layering leaves to ward off rain, and constantly watching for snakes, insects, or other hidden dangers. Each decision had required attention, patience, and resilience. Each success reinforced her confidence, proving that even in a world as vast and unforgiving as the Amazon, she could navigate, adapt, and survive. Exhaustion mingled with determination, creating a resolve that would carry her through the nights ahead. As darkness deepened, she allowed herself a quiet moment to breathe and reflect. She was far from safe, far from comfortable, but she had survived. The shelter would not protect her from everything, and the challenges of the jungle were only beginning, but she had a foothold, a place to rest, regain energy, and plan her next steps. In that small, imperfect space, hope flourished alongside fatigue. She realized that survival was not only about skill or strength, but also about perseverance, awareness, and the willingness to continue moving forward, no matter how overwhelming the jungle seemed. That first night, as she drifted into a light, wary sleep, she carried with her the knowledge that she had secured a place to rest, and with it, the confidence that she could face whatever the Amazon would throw at her next.